My wife's lover offered me $10,000 to leave her. He came to my house, sat across from me at my own kitchen table, and he dropped a stack of cash right there in front of me, bills bound in neat paper wrappers, and he laughed. He actually laughed. He said, "Take it, walk away. You were never in her league anyway." He was relaxed, confident, the kind of man who had gotten everything he wanted for so long that he had stopped considering the possibility that the person across from him was anything more than an obstacle to be removed. I looked at the money. I looked at him. I picked up my phone. One call, 3 minutes, and then I put the phone back down on the table and looked at him and said, "Thank you for coming." He left thinking he had won. 22 days later, I sat in a leather chair at the head of a conference table and watched him walk through the door of his own office and stopped dead when he saw me sitting there. His assistant was behind him. She said, "Mr. Calloway, this is your new owner." He looked at me. I said, "Take a seat, Stephen. We have a lot to talk about." He had thrown $10,000 on my table. I had bought his entire company for $5 million in cash. Before I tell you what came next, the look on his face, the conversation that followed, and what happened to my marriage and my life after that week, I need to take you back to where this really starts. Because this story is not about revenge, even though it looks like it from the outside. It is about what a man finds out about himself when the life he thought he had turns out to be something different. It is about what he decides to do with that information. And it is about the specific kind of wealth that nobody can take from you, because it lives in a place that other people's betrayals cannot reach. Like this video right now. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done with that $10,000 on the table. Let us start from the beginning. My name is Nathan Graves, and I am 52 years old. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a neighborhood called Halston Hills, in a brick house on the east side of the city that my father had bought in 1977 for $43,000 and that my mother still lives in today. My father, Earl Graves, drove a concrete truck for Volunteer Ready Mix for 30 years. He left the house every morning at 4:30, and he came home at 5 in the evening, and he sat in the same chair every night and watched the evening news and fell asleep by 9. He was not a complicated man. He was reliable and honest and physically strong in the way of men who had used their bodies for work their entire lives, and who carried that strength in the shape of their shoulders long after the heaviest years were behind them. He taught me 2 things that I have carried my entire life. The first was this: a man's word was the most valuable thing he owned, and the only thing he could never replace once he had spent it. The second was this: quiet men won the long games. Loud men won the opening argument. Quiet men won everything else. I was a quiet kid. My mother, June, worked part-time at a doctor's office and managed our house with the specific competence of a woman who had grown up with very little and who had decided early that her children were going to have more. She clipped coupons. She bought clothes 2 sizes up so we could grow into them. She packed lunches that were better than the school cafeteria so we had no reason to feel like we were missing something. We were not wealthy, but we were taken care of. I had one sister, Carol, who was 6 years older and who had moved to Atlanta for work before I finished high school. We were not close in the daily sense, but we were loyal in the permanent sense, which was the version of sibling closeness that actually mattered when something real happened. School was the place where I learned that I was good at one specific kind of thinking that the standard curriculum did not really have a category for. I was not the best student in the room. I was the student who understood which problems were actually the problem. My math teacher in 10th grade, a woman named Mrs. Hodge who had been teaching in Knoxville since before my parents were students, pulled me aside after class one afternoon and said, "Nathan, you get the wrong answer more than anyone in this room, but you are the only one who understands why the answer matters." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means you see through problems to what they are really about. That is rarer than getting the right answer." I thought about that for years. After high school, I went to the University of Tennessee on a partial scholarship and studied business, not because I had a specific passion for business in the academic sense, but because I understood that business was applied problem solving, and problem solving was the thing I was actually good at. I graduated in 1993 with a degree and $2,200 in savings, and a specific observation I had made during 4 years of watching how decisions got made in organizations. The people at the top were almost never the smartest people in the room. They were the people who could see which room to be in. I moved to Nashville after graduation. Not because Nashville was the obvious choice for someone with a business degree, but because Nashville in 1993 was a city in the early stages of a specific kind of growth that I had identified through simple observation. Population was expanding. Commercial real estate was undervalued relative to comparable markets, and the music and healthcare industries were both pulling professional services behind them in ways that the market had not fully priced yet. I had almost no money. I had a good eye for the room. I took a job at a small commercial real estate advisory firm on Church Street called Pinnacle Property Consultants. 4 employees. A founder named Bob Mercer, who had been doing commercial real estate in Nashville since 1982, and who had the deep market knowledge of someone who had lived through multiple cycles, and who understood that the metric that mattered in real estate was never the price. It was always the direction. Bob paid me $31,000 a year to do research and analysis, and to answer the phone. I did those things. I also, in every margin of available time, educated myself. I read everything Bob had ever written, every deal memo, every market analysis, every client letter going back to 1982. I understood why he had made every significant recommendation he had ever made, and what the outcome had been, and what the difference was between the ones that had worked and the ones that had not. The difference was almost always the same thing. The ones that worked were the ones where Bob had correctly identified what the market was about to understand before the market understood it. The ones that did not work were the ones where Bob had been one cycle too late. I filed this. 3 years into the job, I brought Bob a deal. Not a big deal, a small one. A strip mall in Antioch, a suburb southeast of Nashville, that was 70% vacant, and that the owner was distressed enough to sell at a number that reflected the current vacancy rather than the location's trajectory. I had done the research on the Antioch corridor, population growth numbers, new residential developments underway, retail gap analysis showing the specific categories of retail that were underserved in the area relative to the residential density. I laid it out for Bob on a Tuesday morning. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He said, "How long did this take you?" I said, 3 weeks of evenings and weekends. He said, "You used our data systems." I said, "Yes, I did not think you would mind." He said, "I do not mind, I am impressed." He said, "The deal is real, Nathan. The gap analysis is particularly good." He said, "I want to take this to a client, but I want to do it with you in the room. Your deal, your analysis, your presentation." I said, "Okay." We presented it the following week. The client bought. Bob gave me a 15% commission on the deal. That was the beginning of the real education. I met Rebecca at a charity auction in Nashville in 2001. I was 31. She was 28. I had by that point been at Pinnacle for 8 years and had worked my way into a full partnership role with Bob, who was starting to think about what the firm's future looked like, and who had decided that I was the person he wanted to shape that future with. I had also, in those 8 years, made my first significant personal investment. I had bought 2 residential properties in East Nashville in 1997, when East Nashville was a neighborhood that most of the city's established money was still treating as a liability. I had bought them with combined savings and a small loan from my father, who had retired by then and who had $40,000 in a savings account that he had been building for 30 years. He had said, "How sure are you?" I said, "I am as sure as I can be about anything in real estate, which means I am confident in the direction and uncertain about the timing." He said, "Direction is enough. Call me when you know the timing." I had called him in 2000 when I sold both properties for a combined gain of $160,000, which I split with him 60-40, because the loan had enabled the investment, and that mattered. He had said, "I told you direction was enough." I said, "You were right." He said, "Keep the 60, you did the work." I kept the 60. Rebecca was at the charity auction because she worked in marketing for a healthcare company that had sponsored the event. She was wearing a green dress, and she was standing alone near one of the display tables looking at the auction items with the specific quality of someone who was genuinely interested in the items rather than performing interest in them. I walked over because the item she was looking at was a framed photograph of downtown Nashville taken from the air in 1973, and I wanted to look at it too. We stood next to each other for a few minutes looking at the photograph. She said, "Do you know this neighborhood?" She was pointing at a section of the image near the river. I said, "That is the Gulch. In 1973, it was warehouses. Now it is some of the highest-priced condos in the city." She said, "You know Nashville." I said, "I have been here since 1993. She said, "You are in real estate." I said, "How did you know that?" She said, "You identified a neighborhood in a 40-year-old aerial photograph without hesitating. That is not something most people can do." I said, "Fair point." She laughed. It was the specific laugh of someone who was genuinely amused rather than performing amusement. I said, "Can I get you a drink?" She said, "Yes." We talked for 3 hours that evening. She was smart in the way that I found immediately compelling, which was the way of someone who asked specific questions and listened carefully to the full answer before forming a response. She was warm but precise. She had opinions that she held clearly without being rigid about them. She was the best conversation I had had in years. We dated for 14 months. In those 14 months, I fell in love in the specific way that a 31-year-old man who had spent his 20s focused almost entirely on work fell in love, which was completely and somewhat unexpectedly, and with a clarity that was different from anything I had felt before. We married in September of 2002. The first 6 years of our marriage were what I would describe as genuinely good. We built a life together in Nashville that had the specific texture of 2 people who were both working towards something and who supported each other's working. Rebecca had moved up in her marketing career and had taken a director role at a healthcare consulting firm. I had continued building at Pinnacle and had also, by 2006, started my own investment vehicle on the side, a small private equity fund focused on commercial real estate and operating businesses in the Southeast. The fund was called Graves Capital. It started with 3 investors, including myself. By 2008, it had 7 investors and 4 active positions. We had a house in Brentwood, a suburb south of Nashville, that we had bought in 2005. A good house, large enough to feel like success had been earned, but modest enough that neither of us felt uncomfortable in it. We had the specific life that looked right from both the inside and the outside. And then, somewhere in years 7 and 8, the inside and the outside stopped matching. I saw it the way you saw shifts in a real estate market, in the aggregate of small signals before the signal became obvious. Rebecca coming home later than she used to, Conversations that ended at surfaces that previous conversations had gone below. A specific quality of absence that was present even when she was in the room. I did not press. I am a quiet man. I observe before I act. I observed for 3 months. Then I hired someone to do what I was unwilling to do myself, which was follow the trail of the small signals to wherever they led. The investigator's name was Patrick Webb. He was a former Davidson County Sheriff's deputy who had been doing private investigation work for 11 years and who had the specific professional demeanor of someone who had seen everything and who was therefore permanently unsurprised by any of it. He called me on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after I hired him. He said, "Nathan, I have what you need. When do you want to come in?" I said, "Today, now." I was in his office on Charlotte Avenue in 30 minutes. He placed a folder on the desk between us. He said, "His name is Stephen Calloway. He owns a residential development company called Calloway Homes, about 18 employees, revenue somewhere between 8 and 12 million a year based on public filings. He is 45. He has been divorced once." He said, he and Rebecca have been seeing each other for approximately 7 months. 7 months. I looked at the photographs in the folder. I closed the folder. I said, "Thank you, Patrick." He said, "How do you want to handle it?" I said, "I need to think." He said, "Take your time. The information keeps." I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway of the Brentwood house for 45 minutes. I thought about my father's 2 principles. A man's word was the most valuable thing he owned. Quiet men won the long games. I went inside. Subscribe to this channel right now and ring the notification bell, because what happened the following week is the part of this story that required everything I had built in 20 years of quiet work. Section 3 is where Stephen Calloway sits down at my kitchen table. I said nothing to Rebecca for 4 days after the meeting with Patrick. Not because I was paralyzed, because I needed to understand the full picture before I made any move, and the full picture required understanding not just the personal situation but the financial situation, both mine and Stephen Calloway's. I spent those 4 days doing what I had done since 1994, when Bob Mercer had first taught me how to read a deal. I did the research. On Rebecca's side, I went through our financial documents with the specific attention of someone who was now treating his own marriage as a due diligence process. Joint accounts, asset titles, the house, investment accounts, insurance policies. Everything was structured the way it had been structured from the beginning of the marriage, which was jointly, because we had built it together, and I had never had any reason to consider restructuring it. That was the first thing I needed to address. I called my attorney, a woman named Susan Park, who had been handling my legal work for 8 years, and who combined sharp legal intelligence with the specific quality of never appearing alarmed by anything her clients told her. I told her what I had learned. She said, "Okay, how do you want to approach this?" I said carefully and correctly, "Tell me the options." She told me the options. I asked the right questions. I left with a plan. On the business side, I did something different. I researched Calloway Homes, not as an angry husband researching a rival, as an investor researching a potential acquisition, because that was what I had decided to do with the information I had. What I found was this. Calloway Homes was a real business with real revenue, but it was also a business that was carrying a significant amount of short-term debt. Stephen Calloway had expanded aggressively in 2007 and 2008, which meant he had entered the residential construction market at exactly the moment when the market was contracting. He had survived the contraction, but he had survived it by taking on debt, and the debt was now a structural feature of his balance sheet that was quietly limiting his options. He had a business that looked healthy from the outside, and that was under real pressure from the inside. I understood this situation very well. I had seen it in dozens of businesses over 20 years of investment work. The business that looked fine until you opened the books. I opened the books. Or rather, I had contacts who could open them for me, not illegally, through a combination of public filings, credit agency information, and a conversation with a banker who knew the Nashville commercial lending market and who owed me a professional favor from a deal we had worked together 3 years earlier. What the banker told me confirmed what the public filings had suggested. Callaway Homes was one bad quarter away from a refinancing crisis. The senior debt was coming up for renewal, and the current lending environment, which had tightened significantly, was going to produce terms that Stephen was going to find painful. He had been shopping for alternatives for 3 months and had not found one he could live with. He was quietly desperate, and he had the specific quality of a quietly desperate man. He was making decisions based on short-term thinking while pretending to have a long-term plan. I understood this. I had a different kind of plan. I made one call to a contact at a regional private equity firm who had been looking for residential construction exposure and who I had done 2 deals with over the previous 4 years. I explained what I had found. My contact said, "The debt structure is a problem." I said, "I know. I want to buy the senior debt position and recapitalize." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because the underlying business is healthy. The problem is financial structure, not operational quality. Fix the structure and the business performs." He said, "What do you need from us?" I said, "Co-investment on the acquisition. I want to move fast." He said, "How fast?" I said, 30 days. He said, "That is aggressive." I said, "I know. Are you in?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Send me the numbers." I sent him the numbers that evening. He called me the next morning. He said, "I am in." 2 days after that conversation, my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. I answered. A man said, "Nathan Graves." I said, "Yes." He said, "This is Stephen Callaway." I said nothing for a moment. He said, "I think we need to talk about Rebecca." I said, "Come to the house, Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this at your house?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." He showed up at 9:58. I had coffee on the table. I let him in. He sat down across from me. He was a large man, well-dressed in the way of someone who spent money on presentation. He had the specific confidence of a man who had been in rooms his whole life and had usually ended up on the winning side of them. He looked at me the way a man looked at another man he had already categorized. He said, "I am going to be direct." I said, "Please." He said, "Rebecca and I have feelings for each other, real ones. I want her to be able to make a choice without feeling trapped by obligation. I want to make that easier for both of you." He reached into his jacket. He pulled out a thick envelope. He dropped it on the table between us. He said, $10,000, walk away clean. No lawyers, no drama, just sign the papers and take the money. He said, "You were never in her league anyway." He leaned back. He smiled. The smile of a man who was very comfortable with the power he believed he held. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Stephen Callaway. I picked up my phone. I made one call. It lasted 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Then I put the phone down. I looked at him. I said, "Thank you for coming, Stephen." He said, "We have a deal." I said, "I will be in touch." He picked up the envelope. He stood. He nodded at me with the nod of a man who assumed he had just concluded a transaction in his favor. He left. I sat at the kitchen table and finished my coffee. The acquisition of Callaway Homes closed in 22 days. Not 30. 22. I had moved faster than my contact expected, which was by design. In my experience, the window in any acquisition was always narrower than the timeline suggested. The longer a deal sat, the more opportunities emerged for it to fall apart. The structure was clean. My fund, Graves Capital, in partnership with the private equity firm, purchased the senior debt position from the bank at a modest discount. The bank, facing its own pressures, was willing to sell. We then converted the debt position into equity through a negotiated restructuring with Stephen's company directly, which he had no practical alternative but to accept given the refinancing situation. Stephen did not know who was buying until the papers were signed. His attorney handled the transaction. Mine handled ours. It was a clean deal on paper. A financial restructuring of a distressed debt position into a majority equity stake in a residential construction company with solid underlying operations. The day after the papers signed, I asked my attorney to arrange a meeting at Callaway Homes offices in Cool Springs, a commercial district south of Nashville. We arrived at 9 in the morning. I walked into the building. Stephen's assistant met us in the lobby. She brought us to the main conference room. I sat at the head of the table. Stephen's team started arriving for what they had been told was a routine meeting with the new financial partner. Stephen came in last. He walked through the door. He saw me. He stopped. His face did the specific thing that faces did when the reality of a situation arrived without warning. His assistant said, "Mr. Callaway, this is Nathan Graves, your new majority owner." The room was silent. Stephen looked at me. I said, "Take a seat, Stephen." He sat. I said, "I want to be clear about why we are here. This is a business meeting. Graves Capital and our co-investor now hold majority equity in Callaway Homes as a result of the debt restructuring that your team negotiated over the past 3 weeks. The restructuring was necessary. The underlying business is good. We intend to support it." I said, "You remain as CEO. Your operational role continues. Your team stays. The business continues to function." I said, "The only thing that changes is the ownership." He said, "You bought my company." I said, "I bought a distressed debt position and converted it to equity. The terms were agreed to by your attorneys." He said, "You knew who I was." I said, "Yes." He said, "This is about Rebecca." I said, "The acquisition is about a sound business opportunity. Full stop." He said, "Nathan." I said, "Stephen, here is what I want you to understand. You came to my house and put $10,000 on my table and said I was never in her league. I want to correct that assessment." I said, "You work for me now." I said that last sentence the way I said most important things, which was quietly. The room had 12 people in it. Nobody moved. Stephen looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want Callaway Homes to perform. I want the debt restructured correctly. I want the Q4 pipeline delivered. I want the team to feel confident about the company's direction." I said, "What I want has nothing to do with Rebecca. Whatever happens in my personal life is separate from what happens in this conference room." He said, "You are serious." I said, "I have been serious my entire life, Stephen. You assumed otherwise. That assumption cost you the majority of your company." The conversation with Rebecca happened the evening before the Callaway Homes meeting. I want to be honest about this part, because it is the part that does not fit the clean narrative. I had known for 3 weeks. I had moved through those 3 weeks with the specific focused calm of someone who had compartmentalized the emotional reality of the situation in order to handle the practical reality of it first. The practical reality was handled. The emotional reality was still in the room. I made dinner. Rebecca came home at 6:30. She walked into the kitchen and saw the table set and looked at me with the specific expression of someone who understood that something was different. She sat down. I sat across from her. I said, "I know about Stephen." She looked at the table. She said, "Nathan." I said, "I have known for 3 weeks. I wanted to handle the practical side of things before we had this conversation. The practical side is handled." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means our attorney will have paperwork ready next week. The house will be handled fairly. The accounts will be divided correctly. My attorney and yours will work it out." She said, "You already called an attorney?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How are you so calm?" I said, "I am always calm." She said, "Nathan, I am sorry." I said, "I know." I said, "I want to ask you one thing and I want an honest answer." She said, "Okay." I said, "Was there ever a point where you were going to tell me yourself?" She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I wanted to. I was afraid of what it would cost." I said, "The cost was the same either way. You just delayed it." She said, "I know that now." I said, "So does Stephen." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Stephen came to the house last Saturday. He offered me $10,000 to walk away." She said, "He did what?" I said, "He put the money on the table and told me I was never in your league." She was silent. She said, "Nathan, I did not ask him to do that." I said, "I know you did not." She said, "I am so sorry." I said, "Rebecca, the marriage is over. That is a real thing and I need you to hear it clearly. But I want you to know that the ending of it has nothing to do with Stephen Calloway's money or his opinion of where I belong." I said, "I am ending it because the trust is gone. That is the only reason." She said, "Is there anything?" I said, "No." She said, "Okay." We sat in that kitchen for another hour without speaking very much. Not in the hostile way of two people who were done with each other. In the specific sad way of two people who had shared something real for a long time and who were processing the fact that the real thing was finished. I had loved her genuinely. She had genuinely lost her way. Both of those things were true simultaneously. At 9 o'clock I said, "I am going to stay at the firm's property in the Gulch for the next few weeks while the paperwork moves forward." She nodded. I packed a bag. I left. I sat in the car in the driveway of the Brentwood house for about 20 minutes. Then I drove to the Gulch. Ring the notification bell and subscribe right now. Because Section 5 is what the next 2 years looked like. And what happened to Stephen Calloway inside his own company is the part of this story I did not plan for, but that turned out to be the most important part. The divorce was finalized in 8 months. Susan handled it with the precision I had come to expect from her. The house was sold and the proceeds split. The investment accounts were divided. My personal equity in Graves Capital remained mine because it had been established before the marriage and was structured accordingly. The settlement was fair. Rebecca and I had been in the same city for 20 years and we managed, in the years after the divorce, to exist in that city without the specific hostility that could have made it harder. We were not friends. We were not enemies. We were two people who had shared something real and who had both moved on from it. I saw her once at a charity event the following year. We said hello. We kept walking. That was enough. Stephen Calloway was a different story. He had come into the Calloway Homes board relationship with the initial posture of a man who was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He had assumed, when he understood the acquisition, that the financial restructuring was the mechanism of a personal revenge, and that his actual experience of working under the new ownership structure would be punitive. It was not. I had made a decision before I walked into that conference room, and it was this. Callaway Homes was a real business with real employees and real client obligations, and it deserved to be managed as a business rather than as a personal statement. I brought in an operating partner named James Forsyth, a residential construction veteran from Charlotte who had done 3 successful operational turnarounds in the Southeast, and who had the specific quality of someone who understood both the business side and the field side of residential development. James and Stephen worked together. Not smoothly at first. The first 3 months were the months where Stephen's resistance showed up in the specific form that resistance always showed up when someone's authority had been structurally reduced without being operationally eliminated. He was polite in meetings and obstructive in execution. James called me after month 2. He said Stephen is not hostile, but he is also not fully committed. I said, what does he need? James said, honestly, he needs to understand that you are not running this company to punish him. He is functioning in a defensive posture. I said, bring him on a call. We had a 3-way call. I said, Stephen, I want to say something directly. He said, okay. I said, the acquisition of Callaway Homes was a business decision. The business was distressed. The opportunity was real. My personal situation with Rebecca is separate from my professional relationship with this company. I want you to hear that from me directly. He said, you expect me to believe that? I said, I expect you to look at the last 3 months. Have we cut staff? Have we changed compensation structures? Have we interfered with client relationships? He said no. I said, the business is performing better than it was in Q3 of last year because the debt restructuring freed up cash flow that was previously servicing expensive short-term debt. Your team is doing good work. James is a good partner. The question is whether you are going to lead this company into the next phase or whether you are going to spend that energy managing your discomfort. He was quiet. He said, what does the next phase look like? I said, expansion into 2 new markets, Murfreesboro and Franklin. The pipeline in both corridors supports it, and the restructured balance sheet can handle the investment. He said, Murfreesboro and Franklin are markets I have been looking at for 2 years. I said, I know. The research was in the files. He said, and you want me to lead the expansion? I said, yes. He said, why? I said, because you know residential construction. I know capital. James knows operations. The 3 of us have different things to contribute, and the company is better for all of it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, okay. From that call, the posture changed. The Murfreesboro expansion launched in month 5. The Franklin pipeline was activated in month 7. By the end of year 1 under the new ownership structure, Callaway Homes had grown revenue by 31% and had reduced its debt service costs by 44% due to the restructuring. Stephen was running a better company than he had been running before the acquisition. He knew it. He called me on a Tuesday evening, about 14 months after the Callaway meeting. He said, I have something to say to you. I said, say it. He said, what I did coming to your house with the money, that was wrong. I said, yes, it was. He said, I want you to know that I understand that now in a way I did not understand it then. I said, what changed? He said, James has a mentor program for young guys on the construction side, kids who are trying to learn the trade. One of them came in last month and asked me how I got started, how I built the company. He said, and I told him about the early years, the real ones, when I had nothing, when every job mattered, when the company was small enough that I knew every subcontractor by name. He said, and I realized that when I walked into your house with that envelope, I had forgotten who I was when I built what I had. I was acting like the guy who already had everything. and that guy made a decision that was beneath the guy who had built it. I said, "That is a real thing to understand." He said, "I am sorry, Nathan." I said, "I know." I said, "Stephen, build the company well, that is enough." He said, "Yes, sir." He said it without sarcasm. "I want to tell you about my father, Earl Graves, the man who drove a concrete truck for 30 years and who sat in the same chair every evening, and who taught me two things that I have carried my entire adult life. He was alive to see the Callaway acquisition. He was living in the Knoxville house, the same brick house on the east side, still in the same chair. He was 78 at the time, and his health was declining in the slow way that good health declined, which was not dramatically but steadily. I drove to Knoxville the weekend after the Callaway meeting. I sat in the chair next to his. I told him the whole story. He listened the way he always listened, which was completely and without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "The $10,000, what happened to the envelope?" I said, "He took it with him when he left." He said, "Good." He said, "You did not take the money." I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because it was his way of saying the conversation was over, and I was not ready for the conversation to be over." He said, "That is right." He said, "The quiet man waited." I said, "Yes." He said, "And when he moved on solid ground." I said, "Yes." He said, "That is the whole thing, Nathan. That is the whole lesson, every time." He closed his eyes. I sat beside him for another hour. He died the following spring, April of that year, in the brick house on Fernwood Drive in the same chair, at 6:30 in the evening when the news was on. I went home when he passed. I sat in the chair beside his for an hour after the paramedics left, and after my mother had gone to be with Carol and the house was quiet. I thought about all of it. The concrete truck and the ledger in the kitchen drawer, and the $43,000 house, and the two principals, and the 30 years of the same chair and the same news. And I thought about a man who had built something quietly and completely, not a company or a fund or an acquisition, but a son who understood what mattered and who knew how to wait for the right moment, and who had never in his adult life taken money that was meant to silence him. My father won the long game. He won it without anyone knowing he was playing. That was the real inheritance. Here is what I want to say before we close. The money was never the point. Stephen Callaway put $10,000 on my table and thought he was ending a conversation. He thought money was the language of the situation, and that enough of it would produce the outcome he wanted. He was wrong about the language. The language of the situation was time and patience, and the specific discipline of a man who had spent 20 years learning to see through problems to what they were actually about. What the situation was actually about was not Rebecca. What it was actually about was a man who had convinced himself that the people around him could be categorized based on what they appeared to have, and who had made a catastrophic miscalculation about the person sitting across from him. I have thought a lot about Stephen's apology call, the one where he talked about the young guy in the mentoring program, and asking how he had gotten started and remembering who he had been in the early years. That moment was real. The Stephen Callaway who had built something from nothing in his 20s was a different man from the Stephen Callaway who had walked into my kitchen with an envelope. The second man had forgotten something the first man knew. He had forgotten that the person across from you was always more than what you could see. He had looked at me and seen a husband whose wife had chosen someone else, and he had concluded that the choice said something about my value. The choice said something about the marriage. It said nothing about me. I knew what I had built. I knew what I was worth. I knew the difference between those two things and what I had spent the hours of my life on. The money on the table was an insult dressed up as an offer. I answered it the way my father had taught me to answer every challenge that deserved a real response. Quietly and correctly, and in a way that took a little longer than the other person expected. Graves Capital has 6 active investments now. Callaway Homes is one of them. It is the best performer in the portfolio. Stephen runs it well. We have a professional relationship that is honest and effective. My personal life is different from what it was. Simpler in some ways, quieter. I live in a house in East Nashville, not far from the first properties I ever bought. I have dinner with my mother in Knoxville once a month. I sit in Dad's chair when I visit. I think about the long game. I am still playing it. Thank you for staying with this story from beginning to end. If any part of it connected with something real in your life, like this video right now, subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. New stories every week, real ones that go to places you do not expect. Share this with someone who is in the middle of something hard right now, and who needs to hear that the quiet approach is not the weak approach. Comment below. Tell me what you think about how I handled the situation. Was there a better way? Would you have taken the 10,000? Tell me everything. I read every comment.